Hello and welcome to my presentation about the reproductive systems of sponges, earthworms, and sea stars. Just to clarify, my name is Joshua Valenzuela from the 7 p.m. lab. Now to start off with, sponges, as we can see in this image here and in this diagram, are members of the phylum Periptera. Because they are pore-bearing, they have no true tissues and no organs, which means they do not have gonads like earthworms and sea stars. Sponges are the only organism that we'll be observing today where all processes that occur in the organism happen at a cellular level with specialized cells such as choanocytes and archaeocytes, performing different functions and take part in reproduction and fertilization. So in terms of reproduction, sponges have the ability to reproduce both asexually and sexually, like earthworms and some species of sea stars. By asexual reproduction, I do not mean that they have the ability to self-fertilize, because they do not. Asexual reproduction for these organisms is more of a process of regeneration in which a fragment of the organism's body is removed or torn off by an environmental factor, and it then regenerates, just like some species of sea stars and earthworms, but we'll discuss that more in detail later. So, asexual reproduction in sponges usually occurs when a fragment of the sponge breaks off from the parent sponge due to factors like harsh environments. However, once this fragment lands and attaches to a surface, typically a rock, it will begin to regenerate into a new sponge as the choanocytes and archaeocytes on the fragment reproduce and form the structures of the previous sponge, such as the radial canals and the ostium. Now, a big part of the sponge's ability to regenerate itself and form these structures that the parent sponge had all over again from a small fragment is due to the fact that the sponge harbors or contains these cells called archaeocytes that I mentioned before, and they carry a lot of important roles. For example, they can digest food particles, carry nutrients to other cells, and manufacture the skeletal fibers of the sponge. But most importantly and most interestingly is that these cells are totipotent, meaning that they have the ability to become other types of cells of the sponge. So when a fragment of the sponge breaks off, these cells play a critical role in rebuilding this fragment into a full new sponge by becoming new cells that will give rise to structures of the sponge. Now, sponges also have the ability to reproduce sexually. Like earthworms and some species of sea stars, they are hermaphroditic, meaning that each individual sponge has the ability to produce both eggs and sperm by functioning as either male or female depending on the gamete they are producing. However, most sponges cannot function as both genders at the same time, and therefore cannot produce both sperm and eggs at the same time. This goes the same for earthworms. But as I mentioned earlier, sponges work on a cellular level as they have no true tissues or organs. So the gametes, which are haploid, not diploid, are not created in gonads like earthworms and sea stars, because obviously they don't have any. Instead, gametes are created by other cells like archaeocytes, the totipotent cells that I mentioned earlier, and they create the sperm gametes when a sponge is functioning as a male, and when enough sperm gametes are created in the sponge will eventually release the sperms, as you can see here, out out through the osculum and into the water in very large quantities. So I guess this process is the sponge's equivalent of an ejaculation in a mammal. So as these sponges are in the water, they will eventually be pulled into the water currents created by choanocytes and into the canals of a nearby sponge functioning as a female. Once the sponge are pulled into the choanocytes, they will enter the mesoglia. As we can see, the sperms enter the mesoglia, which is a jelly-like matrix, and within the matrix is the site where the sponge harbors its eggs made from archaeocytes. Fertilization will take place in this matrix, as we can see by this diagram. This process is called cross-fertilization because the gametes came from two separate sponges. After fertilization, the zygote would develop into a mobile larva, the immature stage of an organism. And it will leave the sponge and will have the ability to move around throughout water until it attaches itself to a surface such as a rock. From there, the sponge will eventually develop into an adult form. So moving on from the sexual reproduction of sponges to earthworms, they have a few key similarities, but also a few key differences. For example, both sponges and earthworms are hermaphroditic, but they cannot self-fertilize, and they follow sexual hermaphroditism. So before we contrast these organisms, let me give you a brief background on earthworms. Well, for starters, they are members of the Annelida phyla. They are triploblastic, meaning they have 3 tissue layers, ectoderm, endoderm, and mesoderm. Unlike sponges, they do have organs, and in particular, they have reproductive organs such as testes and ovaries that allow them to produce both sperm and eggs. These gonads are formed from the mesoderm in the postzygotic development, and the germ cells form into sperm and eggs when the earthworm is about 75 days old. So sexual reproduction takes place when 2 earthworms cross paths, as we see in this image right here. And they cross paths, and they cross them parallel, but in opposite directions. Both earthworms will release sperm through seminal vesicles, which are labeled right here. They are very hard to see. And they will release sperm from these vesicles into small openings in their mates' bodies. Once the sperm is in their mates' bodies, they will travel to portions of the female reproductive system called seminal receptacles, which are labeled right here, and they are shown in this image. Now, the clitellum of the worm, which we can see right here, it's this part that looks a little bit wider, and we can also see it in this image of the worm. This part that does not look so segregated as the rest of the worm. Now, going back to this diagram, the clitellum of the worm will form a mucus and a sort of a cocoon that will collect the eggs from the female genitals, unfertilized of course. And then once it has those, it will pass through the portion of the seminal receptacles where the sperm is being stored, and it will collect the sperm. The sperm will go into this mucus cocoon, and it will fertilize the eggs. After which the mucus cocoon will eventually separate from the worm as it is going through the ground. As we can see right here, the worm has detached, and here's the cocoon. And so it will depart from its fertilized eggs. In about 75 days, the eggs will hatch, and the eggs will hatch fully born and developed. They'll be like miniature adult worms, and they will not go through a larva stage like sponges and like earthworms. Like sponges and like sea stars. Earthworms can also reproduce asexually. Like sponges and sea stars, as we will discuss later, earthworms also have the ability to regenerate if a part of their body is torn off. However, regeneration in earthworms is more limited than regeneration in sponges, meaning that it is more difficult for earthworms to regenerate than it is for sponges. This is because if an earthworm is cut, it can only regenerate if the cut is made behind the clitellum, as seen right here. So if this is the head of the earthworm, and the earthworm is cut, the cut has to be made behind the clitellum, around here, or else it will not be able to regenerate the rest of its body. If the cut is made right here, the earthworm will not be able to regenerate because the cut will not include the clitellum. And another thing about asexual reproduction in earthworms is that when it reproduces asexually, it only results in one worm. So if it is cut in half, right here, this portion of the worm will regenerate itself. However, the tail part or the rear part of the worm will not. This part will not. And so, but the earthworm is able to regenerate its tail if its head is still intact and if it is attached to the clitellum right here. Now, the power of regeneration of earthworms lies within the pluripotent cells that it contains. Now, the pluripotent cells are almost like the totipotent cells that I mentioned earlier, except they are more almost like specialized. But they still have the ability to regenerate until everything that the earthworm needs to regenerate this tail. Now that we've discussed both sponges and earthworms, let's compare sea stars. So sea stars belong to the Echinodermata phyla, and they are triploblastic. They do not have organs. They are triploblastic, and they do have organs, including gonads, that obviously play a critical role in sexual reproduction. However, I should mention that there are a lot of different species of sea stars, and not all of them are hermaphrodites like earthworms and sponges. In fact, most of them are dioric, and only a few worms are known to produce both sperm and eggs at the same time. So for a dioric sea star, the ones that are only one gender have a pair of gonads in each arm. As we can see in this image here, there is a pair of gonads in each arm, and there will be a pair of gonads in every arm of a sea star. Each gonad is a bag-like structure in the sea star that is actually comprised of two bags, like structures one inside of the other. The outer bag is a structure that contains epithelial cells and circular muscle fibers, and the inner structure contains epithelial cells and longitudinal muscle fibers. Depending on their gender, they produce either sperm or eggs. These gametes, both sperm and eggs, will be released from the parent star and into the water through their gonaducts, which are not labeled. And I'm sorry about that. Sea stars most sea stars are the only animals that we'll be comparing today that release eggs before fertilization occurs. Because sponges keep their eggs in the mesoglia until they're fertilized, and earthworms do not part from their eggs until after they are fertilized as well. So once a sperm comes in contact with an egg, it is fertilized and becomes a zygote that undergoes cleavage. It undergoes cleavage, becomes a blastula that undergoes gastrulation and turns into the gastrula. After which the sea star has a larva stage called the bipinnaria. At its larva stage, it has a mouth, esophagus, intestine, and an anus, and is able to swim around until it eventually reaches adulthood. Although most sea stars release gametes into the water, there are some species of sea stars that will actually attach fertilized eggs to their body so they can undergo embryonic development. Because of this, the sea stars that are that become fertilized and attached to a parent sea star, they do not go through a larva stage like other sea stars, and they do not go through a larva stage. They will be hatched from their eggs as miniature sea stars, and they will just grow into adulthood. Although most stars are dioric and reproduce sexually, some species of sea stars can also perform asexually. Can also reproduce asexually by splitting in half more or less equal from the central disk. So it should, if a sea star reproduces asexually, it should more or less be cut in half or detached in half, and it has to include a part of central disk, which is labeled right here, number 12. Number 12 is the central disk. And each half will use toadypotent cells to regenerate back into a full starfish, resulting in two starfish. This is unlike the earthworm that will only result in one worm, but it is like a sponge that will result in two sponges. So now that I've gone over all the reproduction processes between sponges, earthworms, and sea stars, I want to wrap things up with this diagram that I've created. So now this diagram shows all the similarities in between all these three organisms. For example, they are all hermaphrodites. Well, only some sea stars are hermaphroditic, but some are. They all cross-fertilize. They all have the ability to regenerate. They all contain totipotent and pluripotent cells that help them regenerate, and they all can reproduce sexually. However, there is some similarities that are only shared between two organisms. For example, sponges and sea stars have a larval stage, whereas earthworms do not have a larval stage. They hatch and they are in the form that they'll be in for the rest of their life. Sponges and sea stars also, when they regenerate into two organisms, unlike earthworms, which will only regenerate into one organism. Sponges and earthworms also have some similarities that they do not share with sea stars. For example, all sponges and earthworms are hermaphroditic. Some species of sea stars are not. They all keep their eggs until fertilized, whereas sea stars will release their eggs pre-fertilized into the water where they will meet sperm and then be fertilized. And both sponges and earthworms follow sequential hermaphroditism. In between earthworms and sea stars, they both have gonads, unlike sponges that do not have gonads. Everything happens at a cellular level, including reproduction. Now, a key difference that I want to point out with earthworms is that they are the only organism that we observe today that have a sort of sexual intercourse. In order for reproduction to occur, two earthworms have to come across each other so they can exchange their sperm and then fertilize and reproduce. And in sea stars, they are the only ones here that are only one gender. Now, that concludes my presentation. I hope you enjoyed.